Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 50th and final chapter in the book of Genesis. Herein we read of the tail end of the story of the book of Genesis, fourth and final patriarchal human protagonist. So the book of Genesis can be divided into two boxes of four categories, the first four of which take place before chapter 11. Those would be the creation, the fall, the flood, and Babel. And then there's four people after that who are respectively the patriarchs of this people who are called and specially selected, the Jewish people, to be a witness of the Father on earth to all the nations. And so that is passed to Abraham in the 12th chapter. Then we read that his wife is barren, and so he struggles to have children. But then Isaac is born in her old age, so named Laughter, because they doubted when they were first told, and then they laughed for joy when he was born. And then from Isaac, he also struggles, but he prays mightily and has two children, Jacob and Esau, the latter of whom is the younger twin brother born clutching the heel of the brother who came before him, who would be the father of the Edomite nations. He had forsaken his blessing by Jacob's trickery, and Jacob has 12 children by about 4 women, and his favorite one is the girl Leah, whom he had labored 7 years twice over to attain. There was no amount of labor or distance he was not willing to attain to catch the crown of his jewel. So Joseph was her son, and then her younger brother, her and his younger brother Benjamin, she would die giving childbirth. So Joseph is kind of all that's left of the apple of his former eye. So he favors him above all the other brothers, and we first meet him in the 37th chapter. He's already the object of envy of his brothers for the preferential favoritism that their father shows to him in the form of a magnificent and costly coat, and also that he's visited by a dream. He's visited by an authentic revelation as even a teenage boy, and he's younger than most of these because he's the firstborn of his the fourth mother who gave birth to those who would collectively comprise the 12 tribes of Israel. And then we read of the interlude but they sell him into slavery because they're so jealous of him. They ultimately conspire to kill him until the intervention of Reuben and Judah, I believe. And they're sold into slavery by Ishmaelites passing along the way. They were not far removed from they sprang from the same seed of Abraham. So there they were selling their distant cousins at this point into slavery in Egypt, and there Joseph goes, but he has a winning personality and he has an inborn instinct for success, and he makes everyone around him love him and trust him, and he is a man of obvious ability. He has the uncanny ability to interpret the meaning of dreams, which ultimately secures his release from prison and earns him an audience before the Pharaoh after being reminded of the ungrateful one to whom he had let out of prison by forecasting that he would live and the baker or cup holder, whichever one he wasn't, would die. He brings it to Pharaoh's attention. Pharaoh is troubled by a dream. He summons this man to his court from the prison, and he's almost immediately promoted to the prime minister of Egypt, and all flourishes there because of his stewardship, his God-given destiny to save, to be a blessing to the nations, not just their own, but to all the nations. He's going to save Egypt and ultimately allow them to provide a breadbasket of sorts to the surrounding nations. And that's where we find his brothers, the Hebrew people, who come down there. They're attracted by the famine, and Benjamin and Jacob, the father, are left behind. And Joseph recognizes them from his prime. They don't recognize him because he was a 17-year-old boy. By this point, he was over a 30-year-old man. That was the age he would have been promoted by the Pharaoh. And so he recognizes them. They don't recognize him, and he kind of toys with them, accusing them of being foreign spies and telling them to summon and fetch their younger brother. And then he ultimately frames his younger brother as having stole from someone in Egypt. And so they eventually reconcile. He bows down. They invite Jacob down. There, the family is safe and secure. They have the leverage of the position of the fourth and final patriarch of the family, who, true to his dream, the dream that he had, which provoked the outrage, which compelled the brothers to conspire to kill him and ultimately enslave him, thanks to the intervention of Reuben and Judah, was that he was surrounded by 12 stars, each of which represented his fathers and his brothers, and all of them bowed down before him. So we witness this come to pass, and he is the second only to Pharaoh, and he has unlimited leverage in friendliness and trust to set up his nation within the nation. He is given the land of Goshen. The Egyptians differed from the Hebrews in that they considered the shepherd's craft to be beneath their dignity, but it was actually cultural perspective. The Hebrews thought it dignified, and so they were given the lands of Goshen, which were the best. And then we read in the 48th, Jacob is nearing death, and he blesses his children and pronounces prophecies which pertain to their destiny in the 49th. And then he's given very specific instructions not to bury him in the land in which he now lives, but the land that was promised to Abraham through Isaac, to him and to them. Even though they return back to Egypt, they're eventually going to be enslaved there, and then they rise up as a newly liberated people to claim and conquer the land on which Jacob requests to be buried. So the opening verse reads, "And Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him." So this is in response to his father's death. In fact, it's not. There's no mention of any conversation before this, so he's weeping and mourning and grieving over the loss of his father. He's kissing him. And then the second verse we read, "And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father." So the physicians embalmed Israel. Israel is the name that Jacob had earned. Israel, he was born with the name Jacob, which translates as deceiver. And we certainly witness that in when he tricks his older brother into surrendering his birthright and the bestowal of the privilege of being the progenitor of the promised people. He earns the name Israel, which means people or nation of El. The suffix El translates as Elohim. So and embalming would have been the standard traditional Egyptian practice, who had been mummifying their own, perhaps before even the foundation of the United Kingdom in circa 3100 BM, before Messiah. And 40 days were completed for him, and so are completed the days of embalming, and the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. Now this was an extraordinary equality to the Pharaoh, according to whom 72 days were allotted for weeping the recently deceased Pharaoh. So Jacob is given the honor of having exactly 2 days less than that which is allocated to the Pharaoh. This is a time of public mourning, when certain restrictions would have been imposed by the whim of the autocrat. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, "If now I have found grace in your eyes, please speak in the hearing of Pharaoh," saying, so he had proven himself at point. There was no reason. This is more a formality than anything else at this point. Joseph and Pharaoh, there's no clash or disharmony between them. It's just the protocol of the order. He is his inferior, and he owed his position to Pharaoh, without whom he could not flourish as he currently was. And he had earned his trust with his excellent competence, his brilliant foresight, and his strategic genius and gift of the hindsight. With the gift of foresight, we who have kind of have this hindsight on it can only look and marvel at it. "My father made me swear, saying, 'See, I am dying. Bury me in my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. And now please let me go up and bury my father and return.'" So he's given the very specific instructions in the tail end of the most recent chapter. And these are the specifications: that he be buried with his father in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite. The Hittites that we read in the 29th verse of the previous chapter, the Hittites were of Turkish stock, or what corresponds to the modern country of Turkey. They were from the north, and of the promised land, but they were Aboriginal inhabitants at this point. They're one of the people who were amalgamated with and replaced. And the because Uriah was a Hittite, for example, just to get a little far ahead of ourselves. And Pharaoh said, "Go up and bury your father, as he has made you swear." So whatever Joseph asked, the Pharaoh has no reason not to give him at this point. He's never done him dirt. He's never done his wrong. He can he's giving him a stable enough ship to keep in balance, at least until he returns. And his father's wish is as good as his grant, because he has served him so well. And Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt. So this is the entire household, the nation of even Pharaoh's servants and the people of his household, and people of dignity and prominence in Egypt are escorting this recently deceased man to the place of that Joseph had promised him he would bury him in. And all the house of Joseph, and his brothers, and his father's house, only their little ones, and their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. So what remains behind is the 11 brothers of Joseph, and what remained of his father's house, and their children, and their livestock were left behind in Goshen. This is the land that Joseph had used his leverage to secure as the homeland of the Hebrew people. It was a great place to be a shepherd, and that's something the Egyptians would not do or could not do. So they provided that service for them. And how are they repaid? With 430 years of slavery. That's getting a little far ahead of ourselves, though. And all the there went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. So this might have been an intimidating presence to those who are standing in the wayside, observing its passage from Egypt all the way to there. It comes with force, chariots, and horsemen. These are militarily protected body to be preserved and embalmed according to his instructions. And they came to the threshing floor at Attab, which is beyond the Jordan, and they lamented there with a great and heavy lamentation, and observed 7 days of mourning for his father. So this is in Joseph. He's beyond the Jordan at this point, and they, being Joseph and company, they were moved and compelled to go into deep, deep mourning, described as by the author Moses as very heavy lamentation. And this is for a period of 7 days, so the equivalent of 1 week that he does this. They do this, rather. And when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning for the Egyptians. This is why its name is called Abel Mit Egypt, which is beyond the Jordan." So the Jordan would have been the Jordan River, which would have formed the western boundary of what became the nation of Israel, but they are to the beyond it at this point. That means in between it and the Mediterranean, and the Egyptian presence is clearly there. And but the Canaanites were the Aboriginal inhabitants there, and they notice that the Egyptians who had come up all the way here to their land and their turf were severely sad, and we don't know what the name quite translates as, but we didn't prepare for it, in all honesty. And then his sons did to him as he had commanded them. So his son, he would have gave bucket list or death wishes that were to be observed and honored and respected by each of his sons, and the plurality indicates that it might have been all 11 to them. And this is a task that was performed by Joseph, but for his sons brought him to the land of Canaan, and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, before Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite as property for a burial site. So this location was procured several centuries in advance by Jacob's grandfather Abraham. He had bought it specifically for this purpose, and it was bought for the purpose that they were there to fulfill. And when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph hates us and pays us back all the evil which we did to him?" So these brothers remember that they had done this to him. They had once combined in confederacy to conspire to eliminate him by death, and then ultimately settled for enslaving him. And Providence had arranged, Yahweh was looking over him in a way he was doing with them, frankly not, because he had providentially arranged to go from the prisons to the Pharaoh's palace, and now he had all this leverage. He had proven himself. They were witnessing that they were forced to bow down before him, and they would have remembered the dream that he had told them, that all 12 of them would be bowing down to him one day. And they're thinking what if he was us? So if they were in Joseph's position, they had already moved to kill him. But Joseph was a different character and caliber than his brothers. He was gentle and forgiving, and he really lived up to the Abrahamic fulfilling of blessing not only all the people. It was in his power to remove. He could have probably crushed his entire family with the amount of power that he had, but he knew that they were together. They were called for a purpose, and that purpose was to become a nation and a witness to Yahweh in heaven. And they sent word to Joseph, saying, "Before your father died, he commanded, saying," so they're appealing to the authority of his father, even though he's now dead, but they are worried because he is dead that Joseph will move against him, that the only reason he kind of called them and summoned them up there was to bring his father, who had never done him any injury or harm. But what about them? They had conspired to kill him when they were youths and lads, and so they're imagining if they were in his position, they would frankly get rid of themselves. But Joseph is of a different mindset and caliber of character than his brothers. "This is what you are to say to Joseph. I beg you, please, forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the Elohim of your father." And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. So this message allegedly comes from their father. He's begging them on his behalf to forgive the brothers. They had came and told him, all they showed him was the coat, which had been bitten off by a ravenous wolf dipped in blood. They had led Joseph, their father, to believe that he had been eaten alive by wolves. So it's not until he gets dragged down there that he comes to an awareness that his beloved Joseph was in the hands of Yahweh the entire time, and for a great purpose, which was to save not only their nation, but another nation and many around it as well. And so, it's a pretty tall request but he's appealing not as their brothers who had betrayed them, but brothers in the same divine calling and destiny. They are all servants of the Elohim of your father. That father would be him, and he's talking about the heavenly father. And so Joseph, for 1,000,001 reasons we can imagine, weeps in response to hearing this. We're going to find out why as we move on. 18th verse. "And his brother also went and fell down before his face. And they said, 'See, we are your servants.'" So they're resigned to their subordinate position. They know that he is the dog who wags the tail. He is the head of their family. He is the patriarch. He has all the power. He has all the leverage. He has all the influence. And they are at his beck and call. They are subordinate to him, as the dream had frankly foretold that they would be bowing down, and they are bowing down to him, especially at this moment in time, begging for their lives, in fact, not to be killed for having tried to kill him. "And Joseph said to them, 'Do not fear, for am I in the place of Elohim?'" So he has a humble awareness of his human station. He does not reserve the power of life and death. His faith is in Elohim above him, and whose hands he trusts. So he has no motive or desire for vengeance, especially against his brothers who kind of betrayed him, but they were still his brothers, and he knew that they were part of the same divine calling and destiny, and he wasn't going to let a little thing like the fact that they once tried to kill him prevent him from doing what he could on his end and keeping them alive to do what they could to found this great nation of Israel, through whom the entire world would be blessed. "And you intended evil against me, but Elohim intended it for good, in order to do it as this day is to keep a great many people alive." So often when evil comes our way, we often think that that Elohim is against us, but it could be that he is for us, because when when pain comes our way, it could be him speaking to you saying, hey, you better slow down. I'm up here. Come find out more about me that there is to know. So the workings of his providence are often arranged. Joseph held his tongue and just advanced and grew and matured. He didn't he wasn't defeated by the surroundings he found himself in, because he always had kept a direct line to the one who transcends all the circumstances he creates in our path to mold us into mature believers and more advanced foot soldiers in the war we are called to wage. So this is a working of providence. They had meant it for evil, but Elohim did, in fact, providentially arrange it, which brings them to this present moment in time. And the reason that he did this was because if he had remained in the flocks with his brother, he could have never made his way down to Egypt, where he would have made his way down into Pharaoh's court and saved the lives of not only of his brothers, but of the nation of Egypt. So he was a living fulfillment of the Abrahamic calling to be a blessing unto every nation. Every nation will be blessed because you are around. Every nation is blessed because you exist, and you exist to spread the light and the news of who Yahweh is and what he can do. And now do not fear, I provide for you and your little ones. So he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So he's making every physical gesture to soften the storm that is in their hearts. They're paralyzed by fear, wondering if he's going to do. They're begging him for forgiveness, and they're actually asking him for to allow them to live. That's how worried they are at this time. But he comforts and calms and assures them by speaking gently. Remember, gentle answer turns away wrath, we read in Proverbs 51. So a gentle answer can quiet the chaotic storms of people's hearts, even when they're not necessarily saying anything against us. And now do not fear, I provide for you and your little ones. So he And Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. So the lifespan of the pre-Diluvian has by this time almost completely diminished, because Abraham's father, we read, and the antediluvian, we read that the righteous remnant, most of them lived to be at least 900 years old. And then in the post-Diluvian, they start off somewhere around 430 years old, then winnow down to Terah, the father of Abram, who lives to be 402 or 203 or 4 or 5, I forget. But Abraham lives to be 175. He was born Abram. He dies as Abraham. And now the Joseph has lived 110 years, and we don't have an accurate calculus. We should on the lifespan of Joseph, but we didn't. So moving on. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. So he lives to be a grandfather, if not a great-great-grandfather, depending on how one applies the term third generation. And he is the father of 2 tribes. The Ephraim, who was the younger, but he was the one to whom it would be blessed. He would be the most prominent tribe in the northern kingdom of Israel after the split, which came after Solomon's reign, because so much so that it would often be referred to interchangeably as Ephraim. And Manasseh is the elder born, and he's kind of he's one of the tribes, but he's also called a half tribe, or so is Ephraim technically, even though they're the most prominent one of the northern kingdoms. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am dying, but Elohim shall certainly visit you and bring out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So he's prophetically portending to the fact that one day they would be brought up to the land they were called to inhabit, but make the most of what you have now because you are here now. but he has this expectation sort of their Abraham was frankly foretold that his descendants would be enslaved for 400 years. It actually adds up when you do the math of being a 430-year period. So Joseph may have been aware of what was to come and what to await. That's ultimately speculative, but we do know that Abraham was given that, and he may have been passed down the promise through him. And Joseph made the children of Israel swear, saying, Elohim shall certainly visit you, and shall bring up my bones from here. So his bones means he's on the edge of death. Even though he's on the younger end, we get that he expired perhaps sooner than most of his older brothers. And he's promising that his bones will be brought up from here. And Joseph died being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. So thus closes the first chapter of Scripture, and what happens after this is things sort of turn bad for the Hebrew people who are in Egypt and not in the Promised Land. They eventually perhaps succumb to the idols in their midst and then are enslaved. And then they are liberated, and that takes us to the story of Exodus, which keeps the narrative going. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.